So you've heard all the bad news about the environment. We're cutting down our rainforests, coral reefs are dying, all kinds of species, birds, fish, frogs, insects, you name it, are all going extinct.
In fact, even though scientists disagree over just how quickly we're losing species, none of it looks good. Estimates range anywhere between 10 and 84,000 times the natural extinction rate.
Okay, so you might not say it out loud, but you're probably wondering at least a little bit, who cares? Lots of extinction sounds bad, but what does biodiversity do for us anyway? Why should we care about losing it? Good question.
First, we should probably ask, what does nature do for us? Well, here's one great example.
In 1989, New York City was ordered to install a water filtration plant to protect its water supply. Other cities had gotten hit by deadly outbreaks of crypto and giardia, and no one wanted to imagine what would happen if something like that hit New York.
But that meant filtering a huge amount of water. About 1.4 billion gallons a day. By volume, that's more than 5 Empire State Buildings. Installing a system that could handle that much water could cost as much as $8 billion. Plus, it cost $300 million just to run it. Even New York didn't have that kind of money.
But where did the need for a water filtration plant come from in the first place? Most of New York City's water flows down from the Catskills, Delaware watersheds. Over the years, people were building more and more resorts, roads, houses, and so on, and its rivers and streams were getting more and more polluted.
But what if New York City paid people in exchange for protecting and promising not to build on the land they owned? In other words, how much would it cost the city in cold, hard cash to keep nature intact?
Turns out, estimates for this plan ran closer to $1 billion. So, that's what New York City did. And it worked. It's still one of the largest systems of clean, unfiltered surface water in the world.
New York's plan to protect its water is an example of valuing what we call ecosystem services. And there are lots of them. Plants and trees produce the oxygen we breathe. Mushrooms and other decomposers take dead stuff and recycle it back into the soil. Wetlands work as buffer zones between land and water, protecting from storm surges.
Now let's go back to biodiversity. Now these ecosystems don't just have one species, but lots of them interacting together. You might guess that the more biodiversity there is, the better ecosystems probably work. That's what Charles Darwin figured, actually, and what a lot of scientists thought for a long time. But when they started to do experiments to really test that hypothesis, the truth of how biodiversity is connected to ecosystem services turns out to be a bit more complicated. Let's look at some examples.
When most people think about pollen, they think about allergies.
And when they think about bees, they worry about stings. But in fact, both bees and pollen are really important for us.
Bees travel from flower to flower, picking up and dropping off pollen as they go. This pollen helps the plant to reproduce and is critical to fruits and veggies like apples, oranges, and strawberries. All told, bee-pollinated fruits make up between $5 and $20 billion worth of goods every year.
And if we tried to do this job by hand, well, we couldn't. People have tried. We just aren't as good as the insects, and it would take so long. So it's a good thing that we have bees.
But the European honeybee, which does the vast majority of the pollination work, is in trouble. Recently, it's been hit by a viral disease, specialist mites, and crossbreeding with Africanized bees, which makes them too aggressive and dangerous to keep on farms. With populations dropping, we're having trouble pollinating some of the crops we depend on for food.
So can biodiversity help? Well, maybe. Some scientists at Princeton did an experiment on watermelon fields and found that a diverse array of wild native bees can pollinate watermelon flowers just as well. These wild bees aren't as susceptible to all the problems that the European honeybee is dealing with, so protecting them and their habitat could be a good alternative for our pollination services. Note, though, that this is just one study, so we need more research to really tell.
The bottom line is that bees provide a valuable ecosystem service for us, and relying on just one bee species is pretty risky.
Bees aren't the only insects involved in our food. Each year, farmers dump some 700 million pounds of pesticides on crops and still lose about a third of them to pests like aphids and caterpillars.
But there are natural predators of these insects like ladybugs and even some parasitoid wasps that are pretty ferocious. The problem is, when pesticides are sprayed on crops, they kill all of the insects, both aphids and the ladybugs that eat them. Now, the aphids tend to reproduce a lot faster, so pesticides can sometimes make the pest problem worse.
Now, some farmers, instead of using pesticide, are trying to encourage these predators by planting shrubs around their orchards. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? In apple orchards, for example, researchers have found that insect biodiversity does a great job of keeping pests at bay. One study found that orchards using this technique cut their fruit damage by more than 60% compared with orchards using chemical pesticides.
Now that's great, but sometimes it backfires. Sometimes the predators start eating each other or competing for food, so the pests spawn even more. In a review of many studies, called a meta-analysis, scientists found that 20% of studies showed that diversity improved pest suppression, but about 10% showed that one superbug eating everything actually did better than a bunch of predators all competing for the same prey.
We do know now that diversity has an effect on this ecosystem service. Sometimes it hurts us, sometimes it helps. So we should keep studying so that in the places where it is helpful, we can make sure to take advantage of it.
So, nature provides valuable ecosystem services. Our very survival depends on some of them.
Biodiversity definitely affects ecosystem services, but the effect depends on the ecosystem.
But we're losing biodiversity fast, possibly really fast.
And we're getting a sense that it's probably best to protect biodiversity because different ecosystems may need lots of different species to function well. At the very least, we need to keep species around so we can keep studying how biodiversity works.
So what can you do? Well, support scientific research on biodiversity and ecosystem services, because the more we know, the better all of us can properly value what nature does and make good decisions about conservation.